The auctioneer laughed when the gavel fell at $25. Anthony's own family called him a delusional fool for buying a rotting wooden box in the dead of the Mojave Desert. But their cruel laughter abruptly stopped the day federal agents surrounded the property, staring into a hole in the ground. The San Bernardino County tax default auction was held in a sterile, fluorescent-lit municipal room that smelled of stale coffee and desperation. Anthony Pendleton sat in the back row, a 62-year-old retired high school history teacher clutching a frayed canvas wallet. 2 years prior, Anthony had lost his pension, his savings, and his suburban Ohio home to a predatory investment scheme orchestrated by a hedge fund manager named Richard Halloway. While Halloway served a minimal white-collar sentence in a cushy federal facility, Anthony was left with exactly $340 to his name. He was a man hollowed out by the world, seeking only a quiet place to disappear. Parcel 884-A, the auctioneer droned, wiping sweat from his forehead. 1.2 acres, unincorporated land near Newberry Springs. Structures on site are condemned. Opening bid is $100. Silence stretched across the room. A few local real estate speculators flipped through their brochures, shaking their heads. Parcel 884-A was notorious. It was located 10 miles off Route 66, accessible only by a brutal, unpaved washboard road. The structure was a 1930s homesteader shack that had been abandoned for half a century. $50, the auctioneer asked, his voice echoing in the apathy of the room. Nothing. Look, folks, the county just wants it off the books. $25. Do I hear 25? Anthony slowly raised his yellow plastic paddle. Brenda Higgins, a prominent local realtor sitting 2 rows ahead, turned around and scoffed audibly. "You've got to be kidding me," she whispered to her colleague. "The cleanup alone will bankrupt him. It's a literal pile of snakes and asbestos." "Sold," the auctioneer said, striking the gavel with a pitiful tap, "for $25. When Anthony walked out of the county building with the deed in his pocket, he made the mistake of calling his ex-brother-in-law Thomas Crenshaw. Thomas had always been a pragmatic, ruthless man who measured a person's worth entirely by their bank account. Anthony just wanted someone, anyone, to know he was still alive and that he finally owned a piece of the earth again. "You bought a shack in the Mojave for $25. Thomas's laughter through the phone speaker was sharp, cruel, and grating. "Anthony, you are officially a lost cause. You couldn't hold on to a decent house in Ohio, and now you're going to play desert rat in a condemned wooden box. Don't call me when you run out of water. You're a fool, Artie. Always have been." The dial tone hissed in Anthony's ear. He swallowed the lump of humiliation in his throat, climbed into his sputtering 1998 Ford Ranger, and drove east toward the unforgiving desert. The drive was grueling. The asphalt of Route 66 eventually gave way to a cracked, sun-baked dirt trail that threatened to tear the suspension from his truck. When Anthony finally arrived at Parcel 884-A, the reality of his purchase hit him like a physical blow. It was worse than Brenda Higgins had described. The shack was a meager 10 by 12-foot rectangle of rotting, sun-bleached pine. Half of the corrugated iron roof had caved in, rusted into a jagged, dangerous maw. The windows were blown out, replaced by decades of accumulated sand, tumbleweeds, and empty beer cans left by trespassing teenagers. The desert wind howled through the gaps in the walls, a lonely, mournful sound that seemed to mock his arrival. Anthony stood in the center of his new domain. The heat was oppressive, hovering near 110 degrees. He had no electricity, no running water, and only a cooler full of ice and sandwiches to sustain him. He sank to his knees in the dust, the sheer weight of his failures pressing down on his chest. Thomas was right. He was a fool. He had traded total ruin for a slow, agonizing demise in the middle of nowhere. But as the sun dipped below the jagged silhouette of the distant Calico Mountains, painting the sky in violent streaks of purple and blood orange, the desert grew completely, profoundly silent. For the first time in 2 years, Anthony's chest didn't feel tight with anxiety. There were no debt collectors here. There were no mocking relatives, no pitying glances from former colleagues. Just the dirt, the sky, and him. "All right," Anthony whispered to the empty room. "Let's get to work." The first 3 days were an exercise in brutal, back-breaking labor. Anthony worked from dawn until the midday heat forced him into the meager shade of his truck. He cleared out 6 heavy contractor bags of garbage, shattered glass, and dried animal bones. To secure a basic water supply, he hired a local hauler named Dale Croft to drop off a 500-gallon plastic cistern. Dale, a burly man with a sunburned neck and a cynical grin, stood by his flatbed truck, chewing on a matchstick as he surveyed the property. "You know, old man, there's a reason nobody bought this plot," Dale said, kicking a piece of rotting siding. "Back in the 70s, folks said this land was cursed. Used to belong to some eccentric bootlegger back in the day, then got passed around in tax sales for decades. You bought yourself a coffin, Artie. The wind is going to blow this thing over the first time a monsoon hits." "Just leave the tank, Dale," Anthony replied quietly, not looking up from his shovel. "Suit yourself," Dale chuckled, driving off in a cloud of blinding dust. By the 4th day, the interior of the shack was finally clear of debris. The next step was the floor. The original pine floorboards were warped, splintered, and dangerous. Anthony decided to tear them up entirely, intending to lay down a simple, level dirt floor until he could afford a concrete pour. Armed with a rusted crowbar he'd found at a local pawn shop, Anthony began prying up the ancient wood. The nails shrieked as they were pulled from the joists. The work was slow, his arthritic hands blistering despite his heavy leather gloves. He was working in the back corner of the shack when the crowbar slipped beneath a particularly stubborn plank and struck something hard. Clang! Anthony paused, wiping a sheen of gritty sweat from his brow. The sound wasn't the dull thud of striking packed earth or a buried rock. It was a sharp, distinct metallic ring. It sounded hollow. Frowning, he repositioned the crowbar and struck the ground again. Clang! His heart performed a strange, fluttering rhythm. Pushing the crowbar aside, he dropped to his knees and began digging furiously with his gloved hands. He scooped away decades of fine, powdery sand and packed dirt. About 6 inches down, his fingers scraped against something smooth, cold, and rigid. He grabbed a handbrush and swept the remaining dirt away, coughing as a cloud of dust plumed into the stagnant air. Staring back at him was a massive circular steel plate, roughly 3 feet in diameter, embedded perfectly into a thick foundation of reinforced concrete that had been completely hidden by the wooden floor. In the center of the steel plate was a heavy industrial turnwheel, resembling the bulkhead door of a naval submarine. Anthony sat back on his heels, his breath catching in his throat. This wasn't a septic tank or a root cellar. The engineering was far too advanced, the steel too thick, and the concrete collar too precise. Scraping more dirt away from the edge of the steel rim, he uncovered a faded, engraved manufacturer's plate. He leaned in close, squinting through the dim light. Atlas Vault and Engineering Company, Chicago, Illinois, installed October 1928. 1928, the height of Prohibition. Anthony's hands began to tremble. He grabbed the heavy steel wheel with both hands and heaved with all his might. It didn't budge. Decades of rust and sediment had essentially welded it shut. Panic and adrenaline warring in his chest, Anthony sprinted out to his Ford Ranger and dug through his toolbox. He retrieved a can of industrial penetrating oil, a heavy steel mallet, and a 3-foot length of steel pipe to use as a lever. He returned to the hatch, drenched the center axle of the wheel in the oil, and waited agonizing minutes for it to seep into the ancient mechanics. Then he took the mallet and began striking the rim of the wheel, trying to break the seal of rust. The deafening strikes echoed across the empty desert. He slipped the steel pipe over one of the spokes of the wheel, bracing his boots against the concrete rim. He pulled. His muscles screamed, his back aching in protest. With an ear-splitting metallic screech, the wheel gave way. Anthony fell backward onto the dirt, panting heavily. He scrambled back to the hatch and turned the wheel the rest of the way. It spun with heavy, grinding resistance until it finally stopped with a solid clunk. Holding his breath, Anthony gripped the handle and pulled upward. The heavy steel door groaned open, swinging on massive, counterweighted hinges. As the seal broke, a rush of cold, perfectly preserved stale air hissed out of the darkness below, smelling of old paper, motor oil, and something distinctly metallic. Anthony grabbed his heavy-duty maglite from his belt, clicked it on, and pointed the beam down into the abyss. The light illuminated a spiral staircase made of wrought iron, descending about 20 feet into the earth. At the bottom, the beam reflected off a polished, tiled floor. Swallowing hard, Anthony tested the first step. It held. Slowly, step by step, he descended into the cool darkness, leaving the blistering heat of the Mojave above. When he reached the bottom, his boots clicked against black and white checkered ceramic tiles. He swept his flashlight across the subterranean room. It was massive, easily 40 by 40 feet, held up by thick concrete pillars. But it was what filled the room that made Anthony drop his crowbar, the metal clattering loudly against the tiles. The room was a time capsule. Against the far wall sat stacks of heavy wooden crates, each branded with the faded logo of the United States Treasury Department. But dominating the center of the room, resting beneath a heavy, dust-covered canvas tarp, was the undeniable silhouette of a vintage automobile. Anthony walked toward the vehicle, as if in a trance. He grasped the edge of the canvas and pulled it back. Gleaming under the harsh beam of his flashlight was a pristine, untouched 1930 Duesenberg Model J, a car so rare and valuable it belonged in a museum, historically reserved for royalty and tycoons. The chrome was flawless, preserved by the bone-dry, hermetically sealed environment of the vault. Anthony's mind spun with impossible numbers. A car like this was worth millions, tens of millions. He moved closer to the driver's side window to look at the immaculate leather interior. He wiped a thin layer of dust from the glass, shining his light inside. He screamed, stumbling backward and tripping over the canvas tarp. Sitting perfectly upright in the driver's seat, its skeletal fingers firmly clutching a heavy, padlocked leather briefcase, was the remains of a man wearing a perfectly tailored, pinstriped 1920s suit. And lodged squarely in the skull of the deceased tycoon was a single, rusted bullet hole. Anthony had just found a multi-million-dollar fortune, but he had also just uncovered a century-old murder. Anthony scrambled backward, his boots sliding against the dust-covered ceramic tiles. He hit the cold concrete of a support pillar, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. His flashlight beam darted wildly across the room before settling back on the macabre scene inside the Duesenberg. The skeletal figure sat in silent vigilance, a gruesome monument to a violent past. The bullet hole in the skull was perfectly round, a fatal execution shot fired from close range. Yet The heavy leather briefcase remained locked tight within the dead man's bony grip. Anthony's first instinct was to run. To sprint up the iron spiral staircase, seal the steel hatch, drive back to Ohio, and pretend he had never bought Parcel 884-A. He was a retired history teacher, not a grave robber or an investigator. But the crushing weight of his poverty, the memory of Thomas's mocking laughter, the humiliation of losing everything to a white-collar crook anchored him to the floor. He took a slow, deep breath, inhaling the scent of vintage motor oil and dry decay. He picked up his crowbar. Approaching the passenger side of the vehicle, Anthony carefully opened the door. The hinges whined, protesting after 90 years of stillness. He leaned over the pristine leather bench seat. Up close, the pinstriped suit was astonishingly well preserved, though coated in a fine layer of grey dust. With a trembling hand, Anthony hooked the curved end of the crowbar into the brass padlock securing the briefcase. He applied pressure. The ancient, rusted brass snapped with a sharp crack. Anthony pulled the briefcase free, careful not to disturb the remains, and retreated to the hood of the Duesenberg. He unclasped the leather flap. Inside, wrapped in yellowed wax paper, were 3 distinct items: a heavy, leather-bound ledger, a stack of sepia-toned photographs, and a thick, sealed manila envelope bearing the official seal of the United States Treasury. He opened the ledger first. The pages were filled with meticulous, handwritten columns of dates, names, and staggering dollar amounts. At the top of the first page, an inscription was written in elegant cursive. Property of Donovan Caldwell. Anthony's breath hitched. As a history teacher, he knew the name. Donovan the Ledger Caldwell was a legendary ghost of the Prohibition era. He was the chief accountant for the Chicago outfit, a man who possessed the financial secrets of the most ruthless crime syndicate in American history. In the winter of 1930, Caldwell vanished without a trace, allegedly taking with him millions of dollars in syndicate cash and stolen government bonds. Rumor had it that Caldwell was trying to buy his way out of the mob by cutting a deal with the federal government, but he disappeared before the exchange could happen. Anthony tore open the manila envelope. Inside were stacks of Series 1928 $10,000 gold certificates, legal tender that was recalled and effectively vanished from circulation decades ago. Just a cursory glance told Anthony he was holding millions of dollars in pristine, museum-quality historical currency. "My God," Anthony whispered. He turned his flashlight toward the wooden crates stacked against the wall. He walked over to the nearest crate and wedged his crowbar beneath the lid. The wood splintered easily. Inside, packed in straw, were rows of heavy rectangular canvas bags. Anthony opened one, his flashlight illuminating the dull, heavy gleam of solid gold bullion. Caldwell hadn't just stolen cash. He had stolen a fortune in untraceable gold reserves, likely the outfit's entire emergency treasury. Caldwell had built this vault to hide his stolen empire, waiting for the heat to die down. But the mob had found him. They had sent a hitman to the desert, put a bullet in Caldwell's head, and, for some inexplicable reason, sealed the vault with the treasure still inside. Perhaps the hitman didn't know the combination to the inner vault doors, or perhaps a sudden desert flash flood had buried the hatch before the syndicate could return with a crew to extract the gold. Whatever the reason, history had buried Donovan Caldwell, and Anthony Pendleton had just resurrected him. Well, 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 look what the desert rat dragged up. Anthony spun around, dropping the gold bar. The heavy thud echoed off the concrete walls. Standing at the base of the spiral staircase, A heavy tire iron gripped in his meaty fist, was Dale Croft. The water hauler's face was twisted into a greedy, manic grin. "I was halfway back to town when I realized I forgot to give you the invoice for the cistern," Dale said, stepping off the last iron stair. His eyes darted around the subterranean room, taking in the Duesenberg, the open crate, and the gold bar lying at Anthony's feet. "Saw your truck. Saw the big hole in the floor. Thought you might have fallen into an old septic tank. But this is a whole lot better than sewage." "Dale, listen to me," Anthony said, holding his hands up placatingly. "We need to call the authorities. This is a federal crime scene. That man in the car is dead, Artie," Dale interrupted, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly timbre. He tapped the tire iron against the ceramic floor. "He ain't gonna care if his gold goes missing. And honestly, neither will you. Because you're gonna pack all these pretty little boxes into the back of my rig, and then you're gonna stay down here with your new friend." Anthony's mind raced. He was 62, his joints ached, and he was cornered 50 feet underground with a man 20 years younger and twice his size. Dale took a step forward, raising the iron bar. "Start loading, old man." Anthony backed away, his heel bumping against the front bumper of the Duesenberg. His hand brushed against the heavy steel crowbar he had rested on the hood. He didn't have the strength to outfight Dale, but he didn't need to. He just needed to be smarter. "Okay, Dale. Okay. You win," Anthony stammered, faking a tremble in his voice that wasn't entirely artificial. "But the gold is heavy. I'll need the canvas cart over there to move it." Anthony pointed a trembling finger toward the dark corner of the room, behind the staircase. Dale sneered, lowering the tire iron slightly. "Go get it, and no funny business." Anthony shuffled toward the corner, putting the heavy steel support pillar between himself and Dale. As soon as he was out of the water hauler's line of sight, Anthony didn't reach for a cart. Instead, he grabbed the heavy industrial lever attached to the main breaker box on the wall, the archaic electrical system that, while dead, was wired to a massive row of glass fuse bulbs. Anthony brought his crowbar down on the glass bulbs with all his might. The sound was like a shotgun blast in the enclosed space. "Hey!" Dale shouted, charging around the pillar. Anthony threw a handful of the fine, blinding desert dust he had tracked downstairs directly into Dale's eyes. As the big man roared in pain, dropping the tire iron to claw at his face, Anthony sprinted for the spiral staircase. Adrenaline pumped through his veins, masking the pain in his knees. He took the iron stairs 2 at a time. Below him, Dale was coughing and cursing, stumbling blindly. "I'm gonna kill you, you old freak!" Dale bellowed, his heavy boots clanging against the bottom steps. Anthony reached the top, his lungs burning in the oppressive surface heat. He grabbed the heavy steel wheel of the hatch. The counterweights made it easy to move. With a violent shove, he slammed the massive steel door shut just as Dale's fingers grazed the top rim. The heavy metal clamped down with a thunderous boom, sealing the vault. Anthony quickly spun the locking wheel, hearing the heavy steel bolts slide perfectly into place within the concrete collar. A muffled, enraged pounding echoed from beneath the floorboards, but the 3-inch steel plate barely vibrated. Dale was trapped, securely locked in the very vault he had tried to make Anthony's tomb. Anthony collapsed onto the dirt floor of the shack, gasping for air, sweat pouring down his face. He pulled his cheap prepaid cell phone from his pocket. Miraculously, he had 1 bar of signal. He dialed 911. "911, what is your emergency?" the dispatcher asked. Anthony looked down at the steel hatch. "Yes, I'd like to report a trespassing." and a murder. The address is Parcel 884-A, Newberry Springs. You're going to want to send the FBI. By noon the following day, Parcel 884-A had transformed from a forgotten patch of Mojave dirt into the epicenter of a massive federal operation. 4 black Chevy Tahoes, 3 local sheriff's cruisers, and a mobile command center RV were parked haphazardly around Anthony's dilapidated shack. Yellow crime scene tape fluttered violently in the desert wind. A perimeter had been established, manned by stone-faced federal agents wearing tactical vests. Anthony sat on the tailgate of his sputtering Ford Ranger, a thermal blanket wrapped around his shoulders, despite the heat, sipping a terrible cup of instant coffee provided by a paramedic. Agent Leonard Hayes, a tall, impeccably dressed FBI supervisor with sharp eyes and a receding hairline, approached Anthony. He held a tablet in one hand and Anthony's canvas wallet in the other. "Mr. Pendleton," Agent Hayes said, his tone a mix of disbelief and professional detachment. "We've extracted Mr. Croft from the vault. He's in custody. We've also run preliminary checks on the vehicle, the remains, and the currency." "And?" Anthony asked, staring at the dust swirling around his boots. "You found Donovan Caldwell," Hayes said, shaking his head. "The Bureau has had an open file on him for 95 years. It's the oldest cold case in Chicago field office history. The hitman who shot him likely locked the vault to keep the money safe, intending to come back. But historical records show the mob boss who ordered the hit was arrested 2 days later, and his crew was wiped out in a rival turf war. The secret of this vault died with them." "What about the gold?" Anthony asked. "Here's where it gets complicated," Hayes sighed. "The gold and the treasury bonds are technically stolen government property. We are confiscating them. However, the Duesenberg, the vault itself, and the historical artifacts inside? Because you bought the land free and clear at a county tax default auction, and because the original owner died intestate with no living heirs, California salvage and abandoned property laws apply." Anthony looked up, his heart skipping a beat. "What does that mean?" Agent Hayes offered a rare, tight-lipped smile. "It means, Mr. Pendleton, you own the car, and the state of California owes you a mandated 15% finder's fee for the recovery of the stolen treasury assets. My forensic accountants are still doing the math, but conservatively, you're looking at a bounty of roughly $12 million. Anthony stared at the agent. The styrofoam cup slipped from his trembling hands, spilling brown liquid into the thirsty dirt. $12 million. Plus the car. The news of the Mojave miracle hit the national networks by evening. Helicopters circled above the desert, capturing aerial footage of the massive FBI excavation. Anthony Pendleton's face, exhausted but triumphant, was splashed across every major news channel in the country. In a pristine, sterile real estate office in San Bernardino, Brenda Higgins choked on her expensive, sparkling water as she watched the evening broadcast, realizing she had scoffed at a piece of land hiding one of the greatest treasures in American history. And in a comfortable, heavily mortgaged suburban home in Ohio, Thomas Crenshaw sat frozen in his leather recliner. The beer bottle in his hand went warm as the news anchor detailed how Anthony Pendleton, the foolish retired history teacher, had become an overnight multimillionaire. Thomas reached for his phone, dialing Anthony's number with shaking fingers. It went straight to a freshly disconnected line. 6 months later, the gavel fell again. But this time, Anthony was not sitting in a dingy county municipal building. He was sitting in the VIP balcony of a world-renowned classic car auction house in Monterey, California. Below him, the 1930 Duesenberg Model J, fully detailed, polished to a blinding shine, and branded with the legendary backstory of a mobster's desert tomb, sat on a rotating velvet pedestal. "Ladies and gentlemen," the auctioneer announced, his voice booming through the elegant hall, "this pristine piece of automotive and criminal history is truly one of a kind. We have a final bid of $22 million. Going once, going twice." Crack. Sold for $22 million. The crowd erupted into a standing ovation. Anthony smiled, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored Italian suit. He didn't need the money from the car, but he relished the closure. He had used his treasury finder's fee to buy back his old life, and then some. In a stroke of poetic justice, he had purchased the foreclosed, sprawling lakeside estate of Richard Halloway, the very hedge fund manager who had stolen his retirement. Anthony walked out of the auction house and into the cool, coastal California air. A private driver stood waiting by a sleek, black sedan. As he settled into the plush leather seats, Anthony pulled a postcard from his breast pocket. It was a picture of a lonely, dilapidated shack in the middle of the Mojave Desert. On the back, he had written a short, simple message. "Dear Thomas, you were right. The desert was exactly what I needed. Warm regards, Artie." He handed the postcard to his driver to drop in the mail. Anthony leaned back, watching the ocean roll by the window, finally at peace. He had bought a $25 coffin, and it had brought him back to life. What a satisfying ending to an unbelievable journey. From a $25 joke to a multi-million-dollar mobster treasure, Anthony proved that sometimes the biggest risks hold the most incredible rewards. If you loved this wild story of underground vaults, historical mysteries, and ultimate revenge against the doubters, hit that like button right now. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder to never give up, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible true-life mysteries.